Every single time a war breaks out, you'll see the same headlines. It's about democracy. It's about sovereignty. It's about protecting civilians. And sometimes, those things are true. But strip away the flags, the speeches, the UN resolutions, and you will almost always find the same thing underneath. Money, resources, trade, power. The idea that wars are fought for noble ideals is one of the oldest myths in modern history. And in the 21st century, it's a myth that costs billions of lives and trillions of dollars. Because here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. In 2025, the world spent $2.88 trillion on its militaries. That's not a typo. $2.88 trillion. In a single year, the highest level of military spending in recorded human history. According to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, that figure marked the 11th consecutive year of global military spending increases. So the question South Bloc is asking today is this: behind every modern conflict, what is the economy that drives it? Who profits? Who pays? And what does all of this mean for a country like India, sitting at the center of the world's most volatile geopolitical chessboard? Let's break it down. Let's start with a foundational idea, one that geopoliticians and economists have debated for centuries. The philosopher Karl von Clausewitz famously wrote that war is the continuation of politics by other means. But in the modern era, we should update that definition. War is the continuation of economics by other means. Think about every major conflict of the last 100 years. World War I, triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yes, but the underlying tensions were about colonial empires, trade routes, and the scramble for industrial resources in Africa and Asia. World War II fought in the name of defeating fascism, but also a war about who would control Europe's industrial heartland, the oil fields of North Africa, and the shipping lanes of the Pacific. The Cold War, framed as an ideological battle between capitalism and communism, was fundamentally a competition for economic spheres of influence. And when the Cold War ended, the 1990s saw the United States lead a Gulf War against Iraq. The official reason? Liberating Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's invasion. The unofficial reason that every serious analyst acknowledges: Kuwait sat on top of 10% of the world's proven oil reserves. The Persian Gulf region collectively controlled over 60% of global oil supply. This pattern, ideology as the public narrative, economics as the private motivation, repeats itself in virtually every modern conflict. And it is playing out right now, in Ukraine, in the South China Sea, in the Middle East, and along India's own borders. Let's take the most consequential ongoing conflict on the planet: Russia's war against Ukraine. The Western narrative is clear. Russia is an aggressor, violating international law. The Russian narrative is equally clear. NATO expansion threatened Moscow's security. Both of these things contain grains of truth. But the economic narrative is something that rarely makes it to your television screen. Consider what Ukraine actually is, geographically and economically. Ukraine sits at the intersection of Europe and Russia, controlling critical natural gas transit infrastructure, the pipelines that once pumped Russian gas to Germany, Austria, Italy, and Eastern Europe. Before the war, Ukraine was a key energy corridor for all of Europe. Ukraine is also one of the world's great agricultural powers. Before the invasion, Ukraine and Russia together accounted for over 36% of global wheat exports, according to the Economics Observatory. Ukraine alone accounted for 17% of global barley exports and 14% of corn exports. Its rich, fertile black soil, known as Chernozem, feeds hundreds of millions of people worldwide. When Russia invaded, global wheat prices surged nearly 110% within months. Natural gas prices in Europe rose 120 to 130% in the first 6 months alone. According to USDA data, over 258 million people faced acute food insecurity in 2022, the highest number in recorded history, driven in significant part by disruptions to Black Sea grain exports. Russia's strategy has been explicit. CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, documented that Russia was accused of stealing nearly 6 million metric tons of Ukrainian wheat from occupied territories by mid-2023. Russia has weaponized food as a geopolitical instrument, using grain exports as a carrot to African nations, while simultaneously mining and destroying Ukraine's farmland. This is economic warfare, as deliberate and precise as any missile strike. And what is the bill? According to the most recent assessment by the World Bank, the United Nations, the European Commission, and the Ukrainian government, released in February 2026, Ukraine will need $588 billion to rebuild over the next decade. That is nearly 3 times Ukraine's entire GDP. Direct physical damage alone has crossed $195 billion. A single day of war in Ukraine cost an average of $172 million in 2025, according to the head of Ukraine's general staff, up 23% from $140 million a day in 2024. Meanwhile, Russia's own military burden has exploded. According to CIPRI, Russia's military spending in 2025 reached 7.5% of GDP, more than double the 3.6% it spent before the invasion in 2021. Ukraine is spending a staggering 40% of its GDP on defense. 2 nations, economically bleeding out, while the geopolitical and economic stakes that triggered this war remain unresolved. Now let's move to a conflict that hasn't fully erupted yet, but whose economic stakes dwarf even Ukraine: the South China Sea. Roughly 1/3 of all global maritime trade passes through the South China Sea every year. That includes 45% of all global crude oil shipments, 42% of propane shipments, and 26% of automotive trade. The combined annual trade value of goods passing through this body of water is estimated at $5.3 trillion, according to figures widely cited by the Atlas Institute for International Affairs, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and CSIS. Over 64% of China's maritime trade transits this waterway. For Japan, it's 42%. For South Korea, it's critical as well. The sea also sits on top of an estimated 3.6 billion barrels of oil reserves and significant natural gas deposits. Its fisheries generate around $100 billion a year, supporting 3 to 4 million fishermen across Southeast Asia. This is why China's 9-line claim, asserting sovereignty over approximately 90% of the South China Sea, is not merely a nationalist fantasy. It is a calculated attempt to control one of the most economically valuable maritime corridors on Earth. In 2024, Chinese Coast Guard ships repeatedly used water cannons against Philippine resupply missions near the second Thomas Shoal. In 2024, Vietnam resumed oil exploration in disputed waters inside China's claimed boundary. Tensions are escalating. The economic consequences are already visible. As of mid-2024, freight rates on key Asian shipping routes more than doubled. A single voyage rerouted around the South China Sea could add $1 million in additional costs, and those costs ultimately land on consumers worldwide. A 2021 study by the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research found that open conflict in the South China Sea would trigger GDP losses of 10 to 33% for Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. The entire global trading system runs through this sea. Whoever controls it controls a critical lever of the 21st century economy. So far, we've talked about the costs of war. But there is another side to this equation, and it is one that the mainstream narrative rarely addresses honestly. Someone always profits from war. The numbers from the United States are staggering. Between 2020 and 2024, The Pentagon awarded $2.4 trillion in contracts to private defense firms, approximately 54% of its entire discretionary spending over that period. Of that, a single figure stands out. $771 billion went to just 5 companies. Lockheed Martin received $313 billion in contracts. RTX, formerly Raytheon, received $145 billion. Boeing, $115 billion. General Dynamics, $116 billion. Northrop Grumman, $81 billion. By comparison, according to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, the United States spent only $356 billion on diplomacy, development, and humanitarian aid over the same 5 years. In other words, America spent more than twice as much on 5 weapons manufacturers as on diplomacy with the entire world. Lockheed's expected revenue for 2025 was between $74.25 to $74.75 billion. Missile production ramp-ups for programs like JASSM, Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles, and LRASM are surging. Sales of F-35s are climbing. Lockheed's Aeronautics Division reported a 6% jump in operating profits in early 2025, driven almost entirely by higher F-35 production volumes. Between 2020 and 2025, the top 5 defense contractors spent $110 billion on buybacks and dividends, returning wealth to shareholders while lobbying governments to sustain the conditions that make conflict profitable. There are now 950 lobbyists hired by the arms industry in Washington alone, 220 more than in 2020. And at the global level, between 2016 and 2025, worldwide arms sales reached $295 billion in total. The United States is the world's largest arms exporter, controlling 39% of the global arms trade. This is the political economy of war. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented, published, audited financial reality of how modern conflict works. Russia's invasion of Ukraine didn't just destroy Ukrainian cities. It fundamentally transformed European economic thinking. For decades, Europe built its economic model on cheap Russian energy and the assumption that trade would prevent conflict. That assumption collapsed on February 24, 2022. Since then, European defense spending has surged. In 2025, Europe allocated almost $563 billion to defense, a 12.6% year-on-year increase. Spain and Norway led the pack, each increasing military spending by approximately 50% in a single year. Germany's defense funding rose 18%. Poland, Sweden, and Canada all posted gains exceeding 20%. At the NATO summit in The Hague in June 2025, members committed to investing a minimum of 3.5% of GDP annually on core defense requirements. That is up from 2%, a target most European nations had already struggled to meet. The economic cost of this rearmament is enormous, and it is coming at the expense of healthcare, education, and infrastructure investment. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres put it plainly. Less than 4% of global military spending, about $93 billion, would be enough to end world hunger by 2030. Just over 10%, $285 billion, could fully vaccinate every child on Earth. The guns versus butter trade-off is no longer a textbook exercise. It is a live policy choice being made by every major government on Earth right now. Now let's bring this home, because India sits at the intersection of nearly every one of these economic and geopolitical pressures. India is now the 5th largest military spender in the world, according to CIPRI's 2025 data. India's defense budget for 2025 to 26 was set at 6.81 lakh crore rupees, approximately $78 billion, a 9.53% increase from the previous year. India faces a two-front strategic challenge. To the west, Pakistan, with which India fought 4 wars and multiple near conflicts, most recently Operation Sindoor in May 2025. To the north and east, China, whose military spending in 2025 reached $336 billion, more than 4 times India's, and which has been engaged in a sustained military buildup along the 3,440-kilometer disputed line of actual control. According to ORF, the Observer Research Foundation, India's defense allocation reflects a familiar paradox: strategic ambition constrained by fiscal and structural realities. India's defense spending as a share of GDP has hovered around 1.9 to 2.2%, below the 2.5% global average, and far below what its strategic environment demands. The economic dimensions of India's security challenge are profound. The Indian Ocean, through which India's trade lifeline passes, is increasingly contested. China's Belt and Road Initiative has established ports in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, the so-called String of Pearls, creating potential naval choke points around India's maritime perimeter. Meanwhile, India has responded economically. Defense production hit 1.5 lakh crore rupees in 2025. India signed a landmark 10-year defense partnership with the United States in October 2025. India signed deals to co-produce the Hammer precision weapon with France, and the government signed 193 defense contracts worth over 2.09 lakh crore rupees in 2025, with 177 of those contracts going to domestic industry, driven by the Atmanirbhar Bharat framework. India's strategic calculus is clear. Don't just buy weapons. Build an economy around making them. This is India's attempt to turn its security challenge into an economic opportunity. Let's step back and look at the full picture. Global military spending in 2025 hit $2.88 trillion, the highest in recorded human history. That's 2.5% of the entire global economy devoted to the instruments of violence and deterrence. Ukraine's reconstruction bill stands at $588 billion, nearly 3 times its GDP, while the war continues. The South China Sea carries $5.3 trillion in annual trade and sits on top of billions of barrels of untapped oil. 5 American defense companies received $771 billion in government contracts in 5 years, while the global diplomacy budget was half that. Europe is rearming at a pace not seen since the Cold War, redirecting hundreds of billions from social development to deterrence. And India, the world's most populous country, the 5th largest economy, and a rising power, is navigating all of these pressures simultaneously, trying to build strategic depth while financing development for 1.4 billion people. Here is the uncomfortable truth that modern geopolitics forces us to confront. The decision to go to war is never purely ideological. It is always, at its core, a calculation of economic interest. Who controls the grain? Who controls the energy corridor? Who controls the shipping lane? Who controls the rare earth minerals? Who controls the arms supply chain? The flags and the speeches come after. The economic stakes come first. As India watches these dynamics unfold, from the South China Sea to Ukraine, from the Horn of Africa to Central Asia, the challenge for New Delhi is not simply to spend more on defense. The challenge is to build an economy, a defense industrial base, and a diplomatic architecture that allows India to shape the rules of this game, rather than simply play by rules written by others. Because in the 21st century, the nations that understand the economics of war are the nations that don't have to fight them.